This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 555. Ta-da! Masculists' key concept describing women. Parasites. Description. Masculists note that the big 3 ways that women gender oppress men for decades of men's lives, that is, manslavery, divorce, rape, forced fathering, have something in common. They all involve women's parasitism of the money and labour of a man. So masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic arses and fit up, or be severely punished by men, masculisted men, by not getting one. Masculists aim to wipe out fluffiedom by wiping out fluffies and fluffy feminists, who are even more hated due to their hypocrisy and genocide. Flyer itself. Masculists' key concept describing women - parasites, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. What do the big 3 ways in which women massively oppress men for decades of men's lives have in common? Answer: parasitism. Masculism is the obvious male equivalent of the word feminism, which means women's lib, that is, the liberation of women, that is, freeing women from being chattels under men without legal rights, treated as dependents and children of men, that the feminists have been complaining about for several centuries. But what does the word masculist mean? Obviously, it should mean men's lib. But what do men have to be liberated from? This is a question often asked by feminists who have been pumped full of the idea all their lives that gender oppression is a one-way street, that women are the oppressed and men are their oppressors. Masculists claim that women oppress men far worse, since many of the massive gender crimes that women commit against men last decades, making them far more serious than the rather milder ways that men oppress women. For example, masculists consider even rape, one of the worst ways that men oppress women, as rather small beer compared to the massively gender criminal ways that women oppress men, such as women's decades-lasting manslavery, women's decades-lasting divorce rape, women's decades-lasting forced fatherhood, that is, the masculist big 3 gender crimes that women commit against men. Masculists claim that feminism had to come first, because masculism, since the core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man's slaves to women, working for women for decades of a man's life. If men rebelled against man's slavery before women became FIPs, that's financially independent persons, as a result of feminist female careerism, then a century or more ago, the nuclear family that the man was solely financially supporting would have starved. A century or more ago, women had no contraception, so often had a dozen kids, half of whom died. There were no household gadgets, no electricity, no higher education for women. So women were fully occupied at home, raising their many kids, while the husband, the father, was out of the house, in the fields, or working in a factory to earn the money to keep the whole family financially afloat. So common sense says that feminism, that is female careerism, had to come first, before masculism. Now is the decade, the 2020s, of men's liberation, masculism, in which men finally have the financial luxury to cast off their yoke of man-slavery to women, working for women for decades of men's lives, just to get a bit of sex from them from time to time. Masculists claim that it was men who liberated women by giving women science-based medicine, so that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years, and the contraceptive pill, so that women now have effective birth control, so typically have 0, 1 or 2 kids, so now have a career window of half a century, even those women who stay at home for some years, raising small children. So the masculists now stand up, point the finger at women and tell them, quote, "Now that you women have a life expectancy of 85 years and a career window of half a century, you have a very powerful moral obligation to fip up, to pull your financial weight by taking financial responsibility for your own life and not expect to be a fluffy man-slaver." End quote. A fluffie, based on the word fluff, is a masculinist label for a traditional woman who expects to be able to live off the money and labour of a man. Fluffies are hated by masculists, seen as man-slaving vermin to be wiped out by being totally ignored, not even pumped and dumped, thus exterminating them slowly, forcing them into a slow, miserable death if they don't fip up by getting career competent educations so that they can be responsible fips as adults and not aim to man-slave a man. Masculism will force women to grow up, to fip up, to become responsible adults and not expect to be dependents on men, the way women have been forever until now. Women have always been parasitic on men. Women evolved that way. When the pre-human baby's brain doubled in size in a mere million years, this meant that women's birth canal had to be wider so that the bigger brain of the baby could pass through it. So women evolved to have wider hip bones, but there is a limit to the capacity of the hip bone to withstand the stress of childbirth when the hip bone has a large birth canal. Higher intelligence, induced by bigger brains, was highly selected for, so evolution favoured bigger brains, but a hip fracture during childbirth was fatal, so evolution found another solution to allow bigger brains in pre-human babies, and that was to have the babies be born prematurely, so that the baby's head continued to grow after the birth. But this in turn created a new problem for human females, and that was that these prematurely born human infants were totally useless. They could not fend for themselves. They could not find food. They could not even walk. So human mothers became tied down with useless infants, so could not run around the savannah chasing game the way men could. So men became the hunters and women became the stay-at-home nurturers of useless infants. So how could women feed themselves if they were stuck at home raising infants? Human females evolved to become the sexiest of mammals, being in sexual heat every day of the month, so as to be able to bribe men with sex, to persuade the men to give the women and their babies some of their male hunted meat. Thus the human female evolved to become a prostitute, to bribe men with sex in exchange for male hunted meat. Thus women became parasites on men's meat that men hunted. Now, of course, men had to accept their dependence on women to grow and raise the next generation. Otherwise, the whole tribe eventually died out. So men had to simply accept giving some of their scarce male-hunted meat, especially in times of starvation, to their women of childbearing age so that the tribe could survive. Women in today's world are still parasites in many respects. We still live in a period of historical, gender political transition in which feminism still hasn't run its full course and masculism has barely got off the ground. It's the task of the Masculists to teach women, to teach society, that women can no longer expect to parasite off a man, the way women have done for several million years. Women now live in a historical era in which they have the pill, household gadgets, higher education, a life expectancy of 85 years and a career window of half a century. So now the time is ripe for men to liberate themselves from being man-slaves to women, working for women for decades of a man's life, just to get some sex from her from time to time. Masculists now place enormous moral pressure on women, particularly young women of age 16 in high school, to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, by choosing to study career competent majors so that they can become FIPs as adults and not man-slave a man. As masculism spreads across the planet, life for a fluffie will become intolerable, as nearly all the young men in her environment, her social circle, will reject her, and with increasing hatred at her man-slavery, at her callous, decades-lasting gender criminality. Masculists have a level of hatred of fluffy manslavers comparable to what the abolitionists had against the slavery of Negroes in the 1800s in the US, an issue that was so explosive that it eventually led to the US Civil War. The abolitionists felt that Negro slavery was such a moral abomination that the northern state abolitionists went to war over the issue. The Masculists today see manslavery as such a moral abomination that they too are at war, but this time against the fluffies. Masculists see manslavery as 1,000 times bigger problem than Negro slavery, since there are 1,000 times more man-slaves in the world today than there were Negro slaves in the US slave period. Masculists argue that they don't have to shoot fluffies the way the abolitionists shot the slavers of Negroes. They argue that masculists only have to totally ignore fluffies, forcing them to rot on the shelf, utterly rejected by men, by masculisted men, so that their fluffy genes are removed from the gene pool, forcing these fluffy women into a slow, miserable death. This is the end of part 1.